Welcome back to ANTHR1. This is Intro to Physical Anthropology. Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I am David Leitner. I'm your instructor. And today we're going to talk about genotype to phenotype. How do you go from the gene to the trait? What's that look like? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. That should set us up so in the next video we can talk about Mendel and Mendelian genetics. Okay, so with no further ado, let's get started here. First thing I want to do is cover a little bit of vocabulary that we're going to need. Genes always come in pairs because remember, chromosomes come in pairs. And homologous chromosomes have the same genes but different versions on them usually. So we call those different versions alleles right here. An allele is just, it's the same gene with a slightly different spelling. So it might actually make a different version of that trait. Like hair color or eye color or skin tone or any old trait that varies. That's how we get variation. Locus is the location of that gene on the chromosome. That specific location. That gene for X trait will always be in that same location on every chromosome that's supposed to carry it. When you have two chromosomes that both have the same version, the same alleles of a gene, we call them homozygous. When you have different alleles, it's called heterozygous. To kind of illustrate this a little bit, we've got these lovely oversimplified chromosomes here, and the little bands, the white band and the purple band, they represent a gene for flower color. So the gene controls the trait of flower color, but they're different alleles. The white band, it represents the allele that causes white flowers, and the purple one represents the allele that produces purple flowers. Both of those alleles are in the same locus, as you can see. That is the place where the flower color gene is supposed to be, on the chromosome. This pair of chromosomes is said to be homologous because we expect the loci, that it's plural of locus, to be all the same on each one. In other words, the gene for flower color will be here, and the gene, another gene will also be in the same place on both of them, and another gene will be on the same place. And that's why we call them homologous. They're homologs. They might have different alleles of those genes, but the genes will be in the correct location. Now, two more words that are very important. Genotype and phenotype. The genotype is just the composition of what genes and what alleles you have. Okay? It is literally the code in an individual's DNA. It's what's actually down there. The phenotype, on the other hand, is the resulting trait, and it's not always a direct line from one to the other. So a phenotype is an observable physical feature of an organism, and it is controlled or influenced by genetic composition. In other words, genotype. So genotype plays a role in phenotype, but it's not always the only role. And that's because genes, unlike here, most genes, a few do, but most genes don't lead directly to a trait. There's an intermediate step where the environment is going to affect how that trait develops. Think about body weight. Okay? All of us have genes that predispose us to certain body shapes and sizes, but those may be altered drastically if we live in a place where food is scarce, versus a place where food is abundant. Our genes may not be able, our body type gene may not fully express itself if food is not abundant. Okay? And if food is overabundant, our body type genes might be overwhelmed by the fact that we're overeating. And I'm not saying overeating is the only cause for obesity or and when I say obesity, I don't just mean like you're a little overweight. I mean sort of very problematic sort of health conditions that come along with being overweight. In some cases. But so the environment isn't just the exterior environment, though, as we'll find out in a subsequent video. The genetic environment is also important. That is, what other genes are in the DNA will have some bearing on how that gene might get expressed. So there is this intermediate step from genotype to phenotype, which we call the environment of the organism. Okay. I'm not going to go into depth in this. I'm going to do that in a different video, but it's important to understand that genes, there are actually two different kinds of genes. There are structural genes that are what we've been talking about, where the gene produces a protein, and that's what it does, okay? They then are surrounded by regions in their, usually at the ends of the gene, where other molecules can bind to them, and that will result in either initiating the expression of that gene, that is the production of protein, promoting it, that is increasing the amount of protein it produces, or terminating it or inhibiting it, that is stopping it or slowing it down. So that's the way structural genes work. Regulatory genes, on the other hand, actually are genes. They produce proteins, but the proteins they produce are targeted at binding to the regulatory regions and the regulatory sites in other genes. They are what causes the initiation, the promotion, the termination, the inhibition. I say they do not produce proteins. What I mean is they don't produce proteins in the same way, where they're producing the protein just to send it out there to do other things. They are specifically producing these chemicals that then go straight to binding sites. And they play a crucial role not only in differentiating one tissue from another, because, you know, the cells in your brain don't do the same things the cells in your heart and your liver and your lungs do, okay? They're all very different cells. And they are different because they have different regulatory sites that have been either that are either initiating, promoting, terminating, or inhibiting the proteins they produce. So it's the different combination of genes that are turned on or turned off that determines how the cell is, what the cell develops into. Now, leaving that question aside, let's keep things simple here. Let's talk about a trait that is relatively simple, the ABO blood system. So ABO stand for different alleles of the hemoglobin gene. And you either have type A hemoglobin, type B hemoglobin, or type O hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries oxygen in your bloodstream, okay? And the different versions all carry oxygen, but as you know, they are not necessarily compatible. If you're a person who produces O, your body may not recognize another type. Produces A, it may not recognize another type. A and B are both what we call dominant. That is, you only need one copy of them in order to exhibit the trait. So if you have just one copy of A, you will be producing the A hemoglobin type. If you have one copy of B, you will be producing the B hemoglobin type. But if you have one copy of O, it's recessive, so you need 2 of those. So 1 copy means you won't produce any O. 2 copies means you will produce O. Now, this leads to a really interesting pattern. The genotypes here are pretty easy. We can list them out. We list 1 letter represent that allele for each inherited chromosome, right? So you can have type A, and we represent dominant traits by capitalizing them, by the way. You can either have genotype AA, BB, OO. Those are all homozygous. That is, they are made of the same allele. You have 2 copies of the same allele in each of those. Then you can have heterozygous combinations, which are AO, BO, and AB. It doesn't matter what order you put them in, but traditionally we put the dominant one first, if that makes sense. Now, take a second here, pause the video for a second, and see if you can predict what the phenotypes will be. What blood types will each of these genotypes produce, do you think? The first genotype, actually the first 3 are relatively easy, right? You only have one choice here. AA, type A. BB, type B. OO, type O. The next ones are where it gets tricky. Pause for a second if you haven't already and figure out what you think those are. The heterozygous types produce whatever the dominant allele is. So in AO, because A is dominant and O is recessive, you have type A. In BO, because B is dominant and O is recessive, you have type B. But what about AB? If both of them are dominant, what blood type would it be? Well, we call them codominant because they both produce each other. They don't cancel each other out. A recessive gene is silenced by a dominant gene, but a dominant gene will continue producing whatever it produces. So that is where you get type AB blood. And therefore, although there are 6 genotypes, there are only 4 possible phenotypes in this system. Okay? Now, this is an example of a simple genotype to phenotype relationship. There isn't much involved in between steps. The gene produces the hemoglobin that it's supposed to produce, and there's not really any variation there. Each blood type is a direct product of the genotype. And this is very typical of Mendelian traits because they are discrete categories. That is, you can't separate them. You can only separate them. An O is clearly an O, an A is clearly an A B is clearly a B. There's nothing in between. Whereas something like height would have a lot of in-betweens if we charted it out. In other words, something like height varies continuously, and something like hemoglobin genes, blood type, varies discontinuously. They are discrete categories. Now, not every trait, in fact, most traits don't work this way. They aren't direct genotype to phenotype relationships. Oftentimes, you have complex traits. Body weight, coming back to this, is a great example again, okay? Body weight itself is the result of many, many, many genes. And when you try to map out body weight of a population, you will get a continuous distribution. That is, a lot more people will have sort of body weights kind of in the middle here, and very few at the extremes. So you'll have this distribution, but it's a continuous curve here, right? there aren't really, there's not a clear, you have to draw an arbitrary line to make separations here. So like, we're going to measure in pounds, so every pound is a different category. Well, that's arbitrary, because I could have measured in kilograms and had different categories, right? That's not true necessarily of a discrete category. There are at least 32 different genes that contribute to larger body types. Different genes affect different components of your body type. They can affect your appetite, they can affect metabolism, they can affect fat storage, all sorts of things. I also want to say here too, the category of obesity is very controversial, and is also one of the big controversies is whether the exact amount of weight you have directly correlates to poor health, and that in fact actually other health indicators are better indicators than weight itself. Now, we know that body weight has a very strong environmental component. The availability and the quality of the food in your environment has a huge effect on how your body will store and use the calories that you take in, as well as the vitamins that you get, right? Your activity levels will affect that. Occupation can have an effect on that because of the amount of activity you get. Cultural norms may put pressure on you to diet, which is not great, by the way, doing fad diets. But that will have an effect on your weight. And that's because many genes are interacting here. In addition to these environmental factors, you've got this genetic environment that is interacting. Some of these genes amplify the effect of each other and others diminish it. So, in some cases, you will find a person who lacks any of those 32 genes, but has a large body type with a lot of fat storage. Okay? How do you explain that? That's because it's a complex trait. There's a lot that goes into producing a fat body type. Okay. So that's our sort of discussion of genotype and phenotype. To sum up, really, genes can have a simple relationship to the traits that they express, so it's direct genotype to phenotype. But most often they are interacting with other genes, they are interacting with the environment, they are interacting all over the place with society and societal norms. And that produces more complex traits. It's one of the reasons that, not only is there not an easy genetic way to address weight gain and weight loss, there is, frankly, also not an easy behavioral or cultural way to deal with it. There's so much that goes into it. No one answer is going to be magic. That's why you shouldn't take fad diets. Just eat healthy, eat a range of foods that give you plenty of vitamins and energy for you to work, and get activity, not because you're losing weight, but because it helps build stronger bones, it prevents bone loss later in life, it helps make you feel better, it helps you deal with stress. There's so many other reasons to do these things than losing weight, by the way. Watch your blood pressure, watch your cholesterol. PSA over. Sorry, I get a little preachy about that one. Anyway, I'll probably re-record this at some point. Anyway, have a great time. I hope you all take care of yourself, and I'll see you again soon.